Welcome back, everybody. It's another edition of Decline and Fall. Now, today we pose the question, what does it take to be a ruler? Does it take the wit of Cicero? Does it take the wisdom of King Solomon? Does it take the cunning maneuvers of a Lorenzo de Medici? The cynicism of a Borgia? Does it take the strength of will of, shall we say, an Ivan the Terrible? Or perhaps it takes none of those things. Perhaps it just takes a very boring Norwegian man whose pinnacle of intellectual effort is watching an HBO show. Perhaps it's that, because that is indeed what faces us in terms of the people who actually run things in this decaying late stage imperium. I refer, of course, to the magnificent philosophical achievement of Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, a man who has graced us with a great work of insight into the way that the NATO machine truly works. And we will be coming to that later. But first, joining me from the once and future Socialist Yugoslavia, and with appropriate kitten, which is showing its opinion of Jens Stoltenberg by moving the camera. It's Kit Clarenberg. How are you and your hairy friend doing over there?
No, indeed. Feeling slightly overrun, to say the least. But it's been another rather spectacular week in decline and fall across Europe and the wider Western world. And like you say, we have some killer first-hand insights of how the decline and fall has been ongoing for a very, very long time. It's just only now becoming a lot more obvious. Let's dive in, shall we?
Well, let's start then with a nation that's been declining for quite some time, which is, of course, the nation of France, namely the French Fifth Republic, named so because the fourth one collapsed in a military coup. Not a lot of people know that. The third one surrendered to the Nazis due to, again, an internal coup carried out by the French ruling class against its own government in order that they could institute a fascist regime. Not a lot of people will tell you that interpretation of World War II. And following on from, of course, the second one, which collapsed in a coup to Napoleon III. That's the less talented Napoleon, by the way. But the fifth one has run into all kinds of problems, namely that its leadership, in the form of the poisoned dwarf Emmanuel Macron, is unable to put together a government which lasts for more than about 5 seconds. The latest one, under the so-called leadership of Sébastien Lecornu, has fallen after around about 13 hours in office. And this, of course, represents a record for France in terms of a dissolved government, all stemming, of course, from Macron's disastrous short-term decision to call early parliamentary elections, which completely backfired on him, which anybody could have told him that, of course, that would happen, given that he's about as popular as a moldy baguette being sold by an Englishman on the French Riviera right now. So the state of play in France is bad. Another government has fallen to pieces. Even some of Macron's former allies in his so-called centrist party are now calling for either early parliamentary elections or for the resignation of Le Petit Napoleon, very petty in this case. But Kip, this reflects a crisis right at the heart of the EU, and of course it very much fits with the title of our show.
Indeed. Well, I mean, I might preface this by saying that I know a number of people in Italy who are absolutely pissing themselves over this because France was obviously would like to joke about how Italy couldn't keep a government together longer than a few months. This is like a new record, I think, in modern historical terms, the collapse of an administration. You mentioned Macron's decision to call early elections. Of course, this was described by the entire pundit class and all of these, mainstream quote unquote journalists as this masterstroke that would neutralize the right wing. in France. In fact, no, it not only galvanized the right wing, it also galvanized the left, therefore placing Macron in this deeply invidious position ever since he has tried desperately to continue to sideline the left, which emerged as the clear leaders in the snap election. And it's just it's kind of gotten to the point where it's like shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic and filling those chairs with the dregs of what's available, who isn't on the left, who isn't on the supposed far right. Yeah, it's a complete clown show. I think that particularly the France has long sought to, and we'll get into this in great detail, sought to take the lead on calling for a European autonomy, for disconnection from the US, both in technological and military and even economic terms. And Macron got quite a lot of positive coverage for giving this kind of Gaullist style speech. Of course, there was nothing behind it because France is a joke and not a particularly funny one in all of those regards. It still has a military that's bigger than Britain's, which is not like really saying anything. Their international clout is waning all the time. This is something that the mainstream media has barely covered this, but Macron is to an extent, you could call him the liberator of French imperialism in Africa. The French are being chased out all over the continent. The Paris is obviously framing this as, well, we're withdrawing. Yeah, so Macron has overseen the withdrawal of French forces from great swathes of Africa, which they still continue to occupy despite the fact that nobody wanted them there. And there is a growing kind of resistance to not only French but also Western imperialism, and this has happened under Macron's watch. And we see this with the alliance of Sahel states. This is the AES, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and other countries, including Senegal, appear interested in ridding themselves of every last shred of French influence. So, he is a rather diminished and diminutive figure, to borrow a phrase from George Galloway about Rishi Sunak, and France. I think that France's internal turmoil is reflective of, yes, it's the fact that it's just shrinking on the international stage. All of its pretensions of being a major European, let alone global power, are dwindling rapidly, and there seems to be no solution, no easy solution for resolving France's internal issues.
Well, this is the case with many of the European powers, but I think with France, they have advanced even further down this route than perhaps even old perfidious Albion itself. And the reason why you mentioned there that Macron came into office in 2017 talking this big game about French renewal. That's the same big game that every president since Nicolas Sarkozy has talked. By the way, the now convicted criminal Nicolas Sarkozy, whose war against Colonel Gaddafi looks more and more like a man trying not to pay back his bank for loans that he'd taken out. But perhaps more on that in future episodes. Every French president has said they're going to renew the nation since Sarkozy. Arguably, Chirac was doing this as well. But what it all amounted to when it came to it in these plans was increased aggression against various different countries around the world, particularly, of course, in North Africa. Sarkozy really got involved in the Libyan war to try and essentially gain control over Libyan assets and destroy an independent African nation state and gain or put something back into the veins of French imperialism as a result. This long term did not work. Sarkozy also intensified attacks against the French working class in order to try and cut costs, particularly pensions, increase the retirement age. The French ruling class have been obsessed with finding their own version of Margaret Thatcher for, again, a very long time now. None of it has worked. They thought that joining the euro would essentially give them a new lease of life. Joining the euro only made their situation worse, as it did with most of the countries that joined it, to be completely honest. And now we have like the final stage, which is the collapse of the CFA franc area in what was once French West Africa. Now, it is probably worth us going back at some stage to revisit what the War on Terror years meant to West Africa, because it meant an awful lot of bloodletting. But the thing at the core of it was that the whole war on Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-like groups was essentially just a giant contract, a justification for the French increasing their military bootprint there. And we know from the testimonies of Malian, Burkinabe, and Nigerian forces that the French were actually not in the business of fighting the terror gangs, but in the business of assisting them, should we say, assisting them to persist in these regions. Because France got a lot out of these countries. They got from Mali a huge amount of gold. In fact, most of the French don't come from France; they come from Mali. Uranium from the mines which left many Nigerian miner suffering from the long-term effects of exposure to uranium because the safety standards at these places were so bad. And now, with the radical, revolutionary, Pan-Africanist governments that have taken power in these countries, you see French assets being nationalized. You see the French army being chased out. You see the influence of these countries spreading, and the French government apparently unable to do anything about it anymore, because the paper tiger in reality is the imperialists. That is who the paper tiger is. And I'll conclude my thoughts on this point. It doesn't matter who gets in next, to a certain extent, if it's somebody who tries to carry on business as usual. In the end, the French ruling class will back Le Pen. That's the ultimate outcome of this, because they need somebody to be more aggressive with the pursuit of the campaign against the French working class and to try and reestablish themselves overseas. That won't work either. Just as Meloni hasn't revived Italian capitalism, Italian imperialism, so Le Pen wouldn't be able to do anything of the sort. What will happen is an intensification of the class struggle in France and more unpredictable results therein. So, or if the French left gets its act together and gets some kind of coalition government in place, perhaps we even could be in with a chance of winning the presidency. That will also lead to an intensification of the struggle in France, because the French ruling class, much like the Germans or the British, would happily burn their own nation to the ground rather than let it go to the left. But the French crisis will continue. And of course, this will kick on inside the European Union and intensify the crisis there, of which, by the way, more later. Kit, did you have any final thoughts on the fate of Monsieur Macron?
Well, I just think more generally, I think it's a really important point to make, and we could probably do an entire episode about this. But the effective destruction of ECOWAS, which is effectively French a continuation of the French Empire in Africa via other means, is not only a huge blow to France, it's a huge blow to European imperialism, because ECOWAS, and I've written about this, it trapped its members, and they had to sign. African states had to sign up to this in order for France to recognise their independence. So they out of the frying pan into the fire. It imposed this what's called the CFA franc or franc. On these countries, which made it extremely cheap for France and by extension Europe to import resources from these countries, but prohibitively expensive for those countries to export anything anywhere else. And it ensured that there was a element of forced dependency where they, as is so often the case, these countries became markets for Western goods and sites for resource extraction. So the destruction or the kind of the collapse of that system, it's a huge blow to Europe, and it's not really being talked about. There is the occasional BBC article about how the junta in Niger has aggressively seized French uranium processing plants in the country. They've nationalized them to almost universal public acclaim. People are cheering this as it happens. It should have happened a long time ago. It's long overdue. And there is a very interesting paper written by, I believe he's Senegalese academic called Ndongo Sambo Silla, called The Crisis of French Imperialism in Africa. It's about a year old now, but it still stands up really strongly. And it's quite clear that, even in April 2024, there were senior French politicians and military officials who were openly stating Africa is, that's where our future and destiny is at stake. We have a responsibility to maintain a presence there, and it's not China or Russia who are going to fill our place. And we fast forward to today, and those fantasies of maintaining control have dissolved, and Russian and Chinese influence in these across Africa is rising all the time. And with China specifically, is helping via the construction of infrastructure and modern factories, etc. It's assisting these countries to make their own products from their own resources, granting them a huge degree of economic independence, which was denied and stolen from them systematically over centuries. So, yeah, I mean, it is quite some. At the risk of repeating myself, quite some decline and fall in a very short time. This is like, a year ago, French officials were talking about how Africa was their backyard. It very much isn't now.
Well, I think it's always worth paying attention to the details about what neocolonialism and its system meant. The system which you've just described, Kit, was put in place by de Gaulle as part of the deal by which the French initially ended their direct rule over these African nations, which is that they would get to have nominally their own governments and nominally their own flags. But as the great Pan-Africanist leader Kwame Nkrumah wrote in his book on neocolonialism, which is the best account of the post-independence system by which all of the African nations were tied to the colonial powers. The French had one system of doing it. The British had another. The CFA franc was the way in which the French chose to do it, which is exactly as Kit's just described. But this was de Gaulle's legacy. And it was the way, as Lenin first realized, and as Kwame Nkrumah expands upon, like if you control the market and you set the terms of trade, and you can basically decide what a nearly independent nation gets to produce, as because you can decide what it can sell and where it can sell it and for how much for, then it doesn't matter if the country's nominally independent, because you control everything that goes on there when the military bootprint can be kind of minimal if you've bought off a comprador elite to run things for you. What we're seeing now is the slow collapse of that system. In fact, more rapid collapse of that system as time goes on. And central to that, and here I will artfully pivot to our next item, central to that is the war in Ukraine and the exposure of not just France, but Germany, perfidious Albion, Italy, and the United States itself as a series of paper tigers, which, though they can create a lot of destruction by moving a lot of money around, were wholly unable and remained wholly unable to actually take on the Russians, and have been exposed as NATO being a completely empty shell. Now, when you've got a completely empty shell, you need an empty man to run it. And no man, as it turns out, is emptier than Jens Stoltenberg, a man apparently with no brain. So, Kit, Jens is our friend Jens has brought out a book, which was an extract of which was run in the Guardian, which presumably was meant to make him look good, but only made him look like what I can only describe as a midwit. What was your reaction to seeing inside the mind of a man at the heart of the imperial machine?
Well, I mean, to say the interior of his mind is a howling wilderness would be an insult to a howling wilderness. I mean, the excerpt that's featured in the Guardian is it is difficult to know where to begin. How pathetic, illuminating, and just outright laughable it is. So this section of effectively focuses largely on the election of Donald Trump, and then Trump's kind of first 18 months in office, and during which time Stoltenberg's preponderant focus was trying to keep the emperor happy and ensuring that Trump's negative comments about NATO on the campaign trail didn't translate into the US abandoning ship, because that would be the end of NATO. Now, I'm kind of plagiarizing Arna Bertrand, who did a very incisive and amusing kind of analysis and write up of these excerpts. But it's this snippet from Stoltenberg's book. It starts out by with Stoltenberg talking about how utterly mortified he was when Trump won, because he and his entire team had basically just assumed that Hillary Clinton had won. And they had zero contingency plans for that not happening. So when Trump did win, they had no idea what to do. They were terrified because of Trump's aforementioned criticism of NATO. And very, very, his first thought wasn't, well, we need to, work out some really detailed plan for how to deal with this completely unforeseen event that we didn't prepare for at all. His first move is to issue very strict instructions on quote unquote self-discipline among representatives of NATO. So exasperated groaning at internal meetings was verboten. There would be no eye rolling at Trump's tweets or public appearances, no mocking laughter over videos, no jokes about golfing or his mannerisms. Zero tolerance was crucial, because you can't piss off the emperor, who, the US providing, up to 90% of NATO's budget. And then it just goes on to document his initial contacts with Trump, where he doesn't come across, Stoltenberg does not come across as someone who's remotely intelligent, remotely, suitable for a role higher than maybe admin in a allegedly major military alliance, and yeah, that his first meeting with Trump, which didn't seem to go very well, with Trump basically saying, well, you should be helping the US. NATO should be helping the US with North Korea. You're in Afghanistan. Why aren't you, prepared to shed the blood of your populations because of Kim Jong-un? It then segues to the Trump's first formal appearance at NATO headquarters in May 2017, and Stoltenberg feels it necessary to say, we rolled out an extra long, extra wide, bright blue carpet all the way from the main entrance to the road leading to NATO HQ. The blue is the color of NATO's flag, symbolizing the Atlantic Ocean. Upon Trump's arrival, he thought it would be a really good idea to try and butter him up by saying, well, our headquarters were designed by the architects Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, who also designed Trump International Hotel and Tower in Chicago, to which Trump responded, I know those people. They're extremely expensive. I don't understand why you chose those expensive architects. Extremely expensive. And Trump just generally expresses just complete disbelief at like how utterly gargantuan NATO's headquarters is and what all of these people inside are doing. I don't think they themselves actually often know. And it goes on to detail how Trump had this very well, I mean, it sounds like it would have been unpleasant to be in the room meeting where he was lecturing all of these heads of European state that you don't spend enough. The US is demanding that you pay more, and we want a ironclad commitment that you're all going to be spending at least 2%, if not more, by the end of this meeting. And the response of European, heads of state was to act like children trying to make excuses for their blunders to their parents, and trying to suck up to their parents so their allowance is reinstated. And Merkel is quoted as saying, "Well, we sent a lot of people to Afghanistan, and our people were killed there." And then the head, the Prime Minister of Denmark, whose voice was shaking purportedly, made much the same point, saying we've lost more soldiers in Afghanistan than the United States, and that's massive in population proportion terms. So they were just desperately sucking up to Trump, saying, "Please don't leave us, please don't abandon us. We'll do whatever you say." We're tell us how far to bend over, basically, which is hardly surprising, really. But it is good to get kind of insider confirmation that European heads of state are this pathetic and this beholden to NATO.
Yes, and I just wanted to draw listeners and viewers' attention towards a very telling exchange when Stoltenberg is meeting with Trump, and I'm going to do a Jens Stoltenberg impression now, just for the purposes of this dramatization. So he's talking to Trump, and he says, "Then, as I had done in many other conversations, I referenced Norway's experiences. You know, Mr. President, as former Prime Minister of Norway, I know it's possible to speak with the Russians." Trump cast a questioning look. "Are you Norwegian?" I understood why he was asking. Over the years, I've received many heads of organizations myself, and it isn't always easy to remember where each comes from. I smiled. "Yes, I'm Norwegian." Now, aside from my tremendously good impersonation of Jens Stoltenberg there, I think that's quite telling because, like, not only does Trump not realize, like, where Stoltenberg is from, but I think that beyond just Trump not bothering to research who he's talking to, which is fairly standard, it's also quite telling in that you can talk to a lot of these European leaders in particular, and you don't know where they're from because a lot of these European countries and their senior levels just morph into the international machine of either the EU, NATO, or both, or various different international institutions. Stoltenberg probably speak more fluent English than I do, and can be easily mistaken as coming from just about anywhere. But that's like a whole cast of European politicians, which is that they aren't really tied to anywhere anymore. They exist in the international bureaucracy, which is what NATO is what the EU is. And it's quite telling that, like, Stoltenberg's not even surprised that, like, this comes up, because they have no real ties to their homeland anymore. Their loyalty is to imperialism itself, and their loyalty is to, really, the imperialism is led by the United States. Now, this leads to an interesting set of encounters, as you mentioned, Kit, at this NATO summit where Trump is pushing for them to spend more. I wanted to mention just a couple of things here with regard to this. First of all, the US insistence that NATO countries spend more in defense. First of all, that's partly Trump being, like, transactional, which he always is, but also it's not only spending more, it's spending more on weaponry manufactured by the United States. which is not only something which benefits US weapons companies in terms of, obvious profitability boosts, but also it means that the US has effective control over the entirety of the European defense infrastructure. Because, as we know from their deployment of various different air defense missiles, like the TAD and the other ones that they've put in place in Ukraine and, of course, in Israel, the US has technological backdoors into these systems. So, if you buy a Patriot missile battery from the United States, the US has left itself a way to which they can switch it off. So that even if it's falls into somebody else's hands, or their puppet changes sides, or the government that they've given it to collapses, they have an ability to switch these systems off by switching off the software, not upgrading the software, doing all kinds of things that would disrupt usage of it. So by insisting, the European countries spend more, then saying, well, you better buy it from us, you are giving yourself total control, as near as can be, of the European defense structure, which leads to a story that we've mentioned before, but it's one from earlier this year. And never let it be said that we are afraid of promoting ourselves here on this channel, which is that, and then this is what Stoltenberg's book reveals, that he knows very well that without the US, NATO doesn't exist. Because not only now is it the case that the US provides most of the budget, they provide, if there was to be a war, it would provide the bulk of the fighting men to actually carry out the action, but also provides most of the weapon systems and the entirety, as you point out in this piece, of Europe's defense infrastructure is designed only to transport the US into the fight, not to actually do much of anything important themselves. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, this piece was inspired by, there was this extraordinary Politico investigation, which it acknowledged that the entirety of Europe's defense infrastructure, if you can call it that, is built on the assumption that the Americans would come to the rescue. And in that context, there is the US effectively controls an enormous amount of Europe's defense infrastructure, which, as you say, they can switch off with a button. And I mean, all sorts of things such as air-to-air refueling is a total US monopoly, and Europe's defense of its eastern flank relies entirely on American financed NATO fuel networks. The US provides Europe's cyber security protection. Without those capabilities, Europe's a sitting duck for cyber attacks, sabotage, and more besides. And even with massively increased investment, Europe would struggle to replace these capabilities. And there's all sorts of stuff about how Europe has weak bridges, sharp curves, narrow tunnels, and a total lack of road signage, indicating how much weight a bridge can carry, which means that even Germany would struggle to get troops, material, vehicles, or any other kind of war fighting resource to Ukraine with any ease whatsoever. It has to be flown in by the US to Poland and then shifted on over the border from there. The Europeans can't do this themselves. But there's another point to be made here as well, which kind of ties in with what you said about how all of these European leaders merge into this kind of amorphous blob, is that for a very long time, because NATO was never about defending against a Russian threat. It was always about defending and furthering US economic interests in the region. Former Supreme Commander Alexander Haig said in January 2002 that the US military presence in Germany, which is vast, was necessary because it provides the basis of our influence in Europe and it keeps European markets open to us. Were the US to withdraw, European markets would probably be more difficult to access. So NATO's actually, for a very long time, in fact, for probably all of its existence, it hasn't attracted top talent. It's attracted kind of nobodies in cheap suits, who are frequently, so many failed politicians from European countries have been helicoptered into high-ranking positions within the alliance, kind of putting them out to pasture, much like EU commissioners, where you have people like Peter Mandelson was rewarded for his service to Blair by becoming EU commissioner. Neil Kinnock was rewarded for his sterling work in destroying what remained of radicalism in the Labour Party by being given a role as an EU commissioner. The same dynamic is true in the Brussels headquarters of NATO, which, as Trump said, wouldn't survive a tank hit. So it's like by token of the fact that all of these European countries are ultimately vassals of the US empire, it's hardly surprising that the people who end up running these countries, and then the people who end up in NATO, they have this heavily colonized mindset. There's a kind of a corollary here as well, which is quite interesting, which is Trump was, yes, complaining about underspending by NATO members in order to boost US defense manufacturer profits. But I do think that there is certainly an element on the right in America, that the Europe leeches off them, and that they're needy dependents, and that get very uppity and demanding, are overly uppity and demanding of the US. But again, this was kind of by design. In the early 90s, what was then the European Community, as it was becoming the European Union, there was talk by the French and the Germans of creating a European army called the Eurocorps. And US officials were very aggressive in warning countries not to join this, and explicitly stated that they wanted the US to remain the dominant power in Europe itself. And so they have deliberately created needy dependence, and then in turn have become dependent on Europe to buy their weapons that are often crap and don't work, like the F-35 fighter, which has crashed so often in tests that even US officials say that it's not really fit for purpose, and it's cost trillions, I think, in development. But European countries still buy it because that's what they have to do.
Well, yes, and I've got on the screen now the figures in terms of like the amount of capital that gets moved between the United States and, well, all over the world, but Europe in particular. The figures are worth noting because it's a two-way exchange. 2024, the US direct investment in Europe topped out at $3.9 trillion. That's not an insignificant number. But European investment back into the United States, $3.6 trillion. So that tells you why NATO exists, those numbers alone. Because as you read that quote from, I think it was Haig out earlier, where he revealed the game, which is it's always been about keeping these markets open. And in the earliest days of NATO, the reason why it was set up, it was never about a Soviet threat to invade. We have emphasized this many times before, but it can't be emphasized enough. No such credible Soviet threat ever existed. Nobody in the Soviet leadership ever plans to invade Western Europe, and nobody in the Russian leadership now has any plans to do similar. The reason why NATO was set up was to essentially stop, by force of arms sometimes, the march of socialism in Western Europe. That's why it exists. It exists in order to do things like, as you and I have discussed before, Gladio-type operations, sabotage operations, assassination operations, and ultimately to threaten U.S. military operations should governments come to power which are not into the liking of the United States, and the British, by the way, as well, who are also neck deep in all of this, of course, inevitably. But these are the reasons why it exists. It was brought into existence as an anti socialist, anti-communist measure. It continues to exist to make sure that those numbers you see there on that chart continue to grow. That Europe is a massive investment opportunity for the United States, and the United States retains the ability to attract an awful lot of European investment back again. Also worth saying that the principal economic engine in Europe, being Germany, still has the United States as one of its primary export markets, and vice versa. So this is tied together. The American right now, as you say correctly, bitches and complains about, like, well, we got all these like needy, obstreperous, assholes, to use the Americanism, demanding things of us. Well, the worst curse that a god can inflict upon a follower is to give him exactly what he wants. And this is exactly what the US wanted, and therefore, when they got it, they can't stand it anymore. And it's the reason why Trump, for all the loud noise, isn't leaving NATO. And I'll just conclude on this point. But what it was also revealed by Stoltenberg's book is something that you and I have talked about before, which is that Article 5, which Stoltenberg whines about constantly, doesn't mean a great deal. Because without the US, there is no Article 5. Article 5 is the Mutual Defense Pledge, basically. Though in reality, the wording is a lot more ambiguous and gives the US plenty of room to wriggle out of its commitments here. But fundamentally, if the US says, no, we're not doing it, no, we're not coming to the defensive, and here we can pivot to our next story, a Lithuania, a Latvia, an Estonia, or even a Poland, who else is going to do anything if the Russians did decide at some point, if, say, some Lithuanian lunatic, maybe with a British lunatic whispering in his ear, decided to stage some enormous provocation to provoke a Russian intervention, is the US going to ride into the rescue? My guess would be no, on the grounds that it's not really in the US interest to defend these minnows. But speaking of minnows, we now, of course, must go to our next story, which involves, of course, a certain Angela Merkel. You may remember her. She used to be the leader of Germany, but now sort of exists in the same political half-life that Tony Blair does, though albeit probably making less money. She has come out with another statement blaming the Baltic states and Poland for the eventual breakout of the war in Ukraine, or the escalation of the war in Ukraine into the special military operation. Now, this is a bit rich coming from Merkel, who, in her previous most prominent statement, implied, or didn't imply, I should say, it should just say, came out instead. The whole Minsk process was a farce. It was always designed to buy time. It was always designed to essentially allow the Ukrainian armed forces, to be retrained and re-equipped by NATO, which is exactly what happened. But now, when everything's going wrong, you're starting to see people in the EU and NATO structures turn on each other and blame each other. And this is why Merkel is saying this. I'll just conclude my opening up of this subject by saying that Baltic states and Poland especially the Baltic states, don't do anything unless there's somebody else behind them. And if the Baltic states were indeed doing this, then they wouldn't have done it without certain forces, namely certain perfidious forces from a certain perfidious Albion, being right in the mix and getting them to do something. That's my instinct on it, but what do your instincts tell you?
Well, I mean, I think that I'm actually digging into the history of collaboration between I'm actually digging into the history of British collaboration with Lithuanian nationalists at the moment for something separate, and I think that there's a kind of client patron relationship between them, which is quite difficult, which can be quite difficult to unravel. So I think that to an extent, yes, the Baltics are yapping chihuahuas, and they frequently act upon the bidding of the British and the Americans. But at the same time, because they feel so protected, they feel that they can go further. And indeed, there were several figures who were involved in the kind of central to the Baltics breaking away from the Soviet Union, who subsequently became senior figures within Lithuanian politics and senior figures within NATO as well. One of them is called Audrius Butkevičius, who staged a false flag sniper massacre in Lithuania in 1991. He has now since emerged as a key figure with kind of leading the proxy war alongside Chris Donnelly, and it's difficult to know which came first, the chicken or the egg. But yeah, I think Merkel's comments, given all of everything that she said about Minsk, and how it was just playing for time, they are pretty ludicrous. But at the same time, it is abundantly clear that that there was even despite the basically the Baltics and indeed Poland were against any form of negotiated settlement in Ukraine. Now the British would 100% have been encouraging them in this, because the British saw the civil war in Donbass as a spark that could ignite a wider war with Russia, which they thought that Britain could easily win, and we're seeing the unraveling of that idiotic, Machiavellian scheme on the steppe of Donbass on a daily basis now. But yeah, it must not be forgotten that there were a lot of people who had an interest in in peace not being achieved in Donbass. In 2020, a nexus of Western-funded NGOs signed an open letter demanding Zelensky not implement Minsk. These are the same intelligence cutout foundations, organizations like National Endowment for Democracy. They're bankrolling all of these groups that were, which were at the forefront of Maidan, and then that Putin saw a lack of they were at the forefront of also trying to ensure that there could be no peace in Donbass. So it's a lot of people's hands were in the till here, and perhaps this is Merkel's way of trying to row back her admission that it was always a lie and it was always a fraud, because the Russians do seem to have actually taken Minsk quite seriously, and Putin expressed personal disappointment and upset that at Merkel's comments when she made that admission.
Yes, and indeed, it is something which Putin comes back to over and over again in most of his statements on the war, and in particular, the origins of the war. In fact, it's one of the things that the European leaders piss and moan about most of all, is that he actually refers to things that they previously agreed to and betrayed, because none of these people likes to be held accountable for anything ever. So when he raises the question of Minsk and the fact that he took a significant political hit by insisting that Minsk be implemented, because what that meant was that the two republics would not be taken into Russia. They would remain nominally part of Ukraine, and that they would get a certain degree of autonomy. This was not what was being asked for inside Russia itself. And also it led to the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, quite with some justification, saying that United Russia were essentially selling out the struggle in the east of Ukraine, and was selling out the Donbass rebellion. And that this was a significant political hit to Putin. So again, he took this seriously for various reasons, which we've gone into before. None of the European powers did. They all saw it as a way of just making sure that nothing interrupted the process of Ukrainian rearmament. And just to pivot back to the Baltic states, as this article from the German Marshall Fund points out, one of the usages of the Baltic states, and one of the reasons why they are an important base for operations for Britain and others, is that they are the principal runners of one of the principal runners anyway of like psychological operations, provocations, various things that are done online involving getting propaganda into Russia itself, trying to secure traitors and collaborators, etc. This is again openly boasted about by the British and others, and again, it's one of the principal reasons why the Baltic states are of use to the Western European powers and to the United States, which gives them the degree of confidence that they do have, that they can stage provocations and that they will be backed up. However, they should always be careful because the British have never been particularly sentimental about their puppets over the last couple of hundred years or so. Just ask the Assyrian Christians what happened to them when the British decided that they were no longer adding value to the relationship, so to speak. But also, you wrote about this a few years ago, Kit, in 2022, which is that in terms of psychological and non-obsolescence, which is these are very forefront of and have been for quite some time. In fact, this is the kind of underhanded operation which Boris Johnson was very keen on, and it was all part of his big plan for re-establishing British influence with minimal actual military footprint. Was that the idea that you could just do it all via the what you call globalized online trolling, and the Baltic states are pretty much at the heart of this in terms of Europe, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is quite extraordinary. So there was this group many years ago that yeah, so no, I mean this is quite extraordinary. So they might be rather forgotten now, but in the kind of height of Russiagate mania, there was this group called the Lithuanian Elves who they received an enormous amount of media coverage as this alleged grassroots effort to counter Russian disinformation. And they were heralded as this volunteer initiative, standing up for truth against the evil, the evil Russian disinformation megalomaniacs in the Kremlin. The reality is that actually they were run out of the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense, and this is where where I mentioned the kind of it's difficult to know who influences who. The Lithuanian Elves model, which it certainly wasn't countering disinformation. It was like, trolling people online, leaving bad reviews of books by academics by Richard Sackwer, just the kind of online harassment, trolling, and stalking, which was subsequently perfected by NAFO, the North Atlantic Fellows Association, which seems to have rather dropped off the map in recent months. But yes, the leaked documents related to the Operations of Integrity Initiative, which was run by our friend Chris Donnelly, and was concerned with spreading fake news about Russia in order to demonize Russia in advance of the proxy war. These documents indicate how the Lithuanian Elves were brought by the British to train militaries, including Britain's own, like 77th Brigade, their psychological warfare battalion, and the Netherlands and other countries were taught in the same techniques. Such was Britain was so thrilled, they were so taken with this idea that they set up what they called an Elves Academy in Vilnius in Lithuania, where they would send academics, journalists, think tank pundits to be taught how to be trolls online, and how to harass people who weren't rabidly anti-Russian. This is completely hidden from public view, but no doubt had an enormous impact on public discourse around Russia and played a not insignificant role in getting us to where we are now.
Yes, indeed, and that is it's remarkable that they needed a training center to train online trolls. They could have just gone onto a Daddy Discord server or Reddit board and picked out the most obnoxious teenagers and just put them up to the task. In fact, maybe that's what they did. But given that NAFO seems to consist entirely of men in their 50s with what I can only describe as quite severe sexual pathologies, that seems to be the primary recruitment market for this kind of operation. Now, I want to move now to a very important anniversary. I think it's important that we cover this week because it was 25 years ago this week that as it turns out, U.S., British, and EU run operation, but principally I think it was the U.S. and the British here who concluded what I would describe as the final part of their maneuver against Yugoslavia, which was the removal of the political organizations that were holding together the last elements of Yugoslavia. That is, of course, the late President Slobodan Milosevic and his government, which
Mm.
following an election, which again, following a very clear pattern now, the US-backed opposition claimed was rigged. And I don't know if anybody remembers this, but the guy who ran against Milosevic was a guy who ran as more of a Serb nationalist than him, called Vojislav Kostunica. I think I'm getting that name roughly correct. And again, follows a very similar pattern, which is that Milosevic was at least trying to keep together some semblance of a Yugoslav federation, was trying to protect certain elements of the old Yugoslav socialist system, basically wanted to do in Yugoslavia what I would say Lukashenko has been able to do in Belarus, which is, yes, move to a capitalist system, but run at least an economy which keeps the strongest aspects of the socialist Soviet, or in this case, Titoite legacy intact. All of this, of course, was completely unacceptable to the United States and the British and Europeans. As you will know if you watched our two-part incredible Kosovo War special, which I would encourage you to go and check out on our YouTube channel. But Kit, 25 years on from the overthrow of Milosevic in what is now known quite properly as, and admitted to in this Washington Post piece from 25 years ago, for the first real modern era color revolution, was it not?
Indeed, indeed, and I think that it's amazing how revealing that Washington Post article is, and it documents how U.S. advertising professionals who were typically marketed chewing gum and fizzy drinks were engaged to concoct catchy slogans and PR stunts and other communications approaches to undermine Milosevic. The U.S. funded extensive opinion polling and focus groups to road test campaign strategy. Scores of parliamentary candidates and activists were coached in how to stay on message and field journalist questions and rebut the arguments of Milosevic's supporters. At the center of this was this student activist collective called Otpor, which is Serbo-Croat for resistance. And they engaged in a wide variety of hijinks and non-violent political protests in order to undermine Milosevic's rule. I mean, and there was some really quite extraordinary stuff like USAID funding 5,000 cans of spray paint for student activists to daub anti-Milosevic graffiti on public buildings, etc. But what this article makes clear is this was just the public face of something that was something far deeper and darker, and it notes that the CIA was up to no good in Belgrade at the time, but nobody really knows what they were doing. And I think that what happened in Belgrade was it set a model that has been repeated over and over and over and over again. There were a series of openly US-sponsored color revolutions, so called because protesters picked a particular color. In Georgia, it was the Rose Revolution. In Ukraine in 2004, it was the Orange Revolution. And they used exactly the same tactics. And those same strategies remain in play today. We have discussed recently how there's been a coup in Nepal. There was a coup in Nepal at the start of September, and at the forefront of this were supposedly disaffected, Gen Z activist groups, many of whom had no prior kind of public footprint or indeed history of political activism, who managed to overthrow the government and install a new interim in administration in a matter of days. And very obvious questions hang over whether those groups were in receipt of direction and funding one way or another by the Anglo-Americans, because Nepal is geopolitically and geostrategically a very important country, which would serve as a very useful source of agitation both for India and China. And China obviously being the number one enemy from the US's perspective, and India kind of drifting into the BRICS camp, much to Washington's chagrin. But it's, I mean, I have reported on multiple US sponsored civil society led coups, old and new. There's always a youth group or cluster of youth groups at the front of this. That's what to look out for when we're told that there's a supposedly spontaneous insurrection overseas. There's another point to make here as well, which is that Otpor, its leading members subsequently formed a group called Canvas, and they go around the world training activist groups to do what they did in Serbia 25 years ago, and leaked emails from Stratfor, which is this private intelligence firm that's been dubbed the shadow CIA by the mainstream media. There are these leaked Stratfor emails where they discuss how devastatingly effective Canvas are, and they say, when deployed properly, they can inflict more damage on a country than a US aircraft carrier. And they still operate in plain sight all over the world, training activist groups on every continent. And in a sick irony, as Georgia, as I mentioned, a site of a follow up to the overthrow of Milosevic in 2003. They recently passed legislation which had a very troubled gestation, forcing foreign-funded NGOs and media outlets to publicly disclose their sources of income. And this led to huge and frequently violent protests and multiple attempted coups, attempts to overthrow the government. And so it's like one of the reasons that the NGO industrial complex, for want of a better word, is so insidious is once they set up shop in a country, they multiply very, very, very quickly. In Bosnia, which is a country of population is about 3 million people, they have over 25,000 foreign-funded NGOs active in every sphere of public and even private life, and the slightest pushback against this or attempt to rein them in, oh, well, this is draconian, this is authoritarianism, this is a crackdown on civil society, it's quite some catch 22.
Well, yes, and see it is very important for the US and the British and the Germans, etc., to dominate the realm of what's called civil society, because as Gramsci observed when he examined this question, these are the earthworks which protect the ruling class and the state. And in this case, if you control what ideas get discussed, what ideas are popularized, what trends are popularized, you can define everything, including protests which start out about things which are real, such as, wage levels dropping, such as standard of living crisis, such as corruption. Because if you control the principal organizations which organize the protests against something, you can guide every single protest down a route that you choose, because you're the one who puts together the plans. You're the ones who field the candidates and train the candidates for office. You're the one who sets the terms of what the protest wants. Now, if again, to go back to what we opened up with, which is talking about neocolonialism, this is neocolonialism par excellence, because it might look big in terms of the budgets, but in actual fact, this enables you to run a country very effectively on quite a small budget, because if you define all of the political terms of reference for the population, then you leave protests with almost nowhere to go, ideally, because like the socialism and communism now are very, very small forces following a generation of reaction and the stamping out of communist and socialist parties in many parts of the world. So in many areas of like Europe, and in many areas of the former Soviet bloc, what you have is parties of oligarchy on the one hand, and parties of a slightly different oligarchy on the other. One of which, though, will be more tied to Euro-American imperialism. And what you end up with in a lot of these color revolutions is that the old oligarch gets chased out by a new oligarch who's just aligned himself with the various NGO organizations who write his propaganda for it. And this is indeed what happens in places like Armenia, where you end up with that wretched little crook Pashinyan coming into power. It's what happens in places like Georgia, or did happen in places like Georgia, where, by the way, they just had another failed color revolution attempt. Because finally, after a generation of this stuff, and again, this goes back to the weakening of the US and the British and the European, people are month the fact that they will be you if they get hold of your country is reduce you to rubble, basically. Economically, militarily, and politically, you will be reduced to rubble in the end, because the only thing they really want to do with you, particularly if you're strategically important, like Moldova, for instance, is use you as a tool against the Russian or the Chinese. But usually, the end will be the country being a pile of smoking ruins, and not a lot of people in Georgia actually. We're thankfully 25 years on from the overthrow of Milosevic. The utility of this is finally reaching its endpoint with more and more people waking up. Kit, did you want to offer any final comments on this particular round of air?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that the threat of, as we've likely just seen in Nepal, the threat of this stuff hasn't gone anywhere. And actually, it was little noticed, but last year, the National Endowment for Democracy used to have a public a database of at least some of the projects it was funding in across the world. You could just type in any country and see what was being spent on what particular projects and what particular groups were involved. And they've removed this now. Now, the National Endowment for Democracy's founding purpose was to do publicly what the CIA did covertly. So I do think that while the removal of this grant database speaks to the fact that, well, I mean, it is in a sense, it makes NED more dangerous because you can't be quite sure who or what is getting money from it. At the same time, it shows that the NED founding principle is completely invalid now. It's null and void. Like open US sponsorship of activist groups, of media outlets, etc. It's a kiss of death. Like, people immediately are suspicious, and can see clearly that if, say, a protest group is in receipt of US money, its ultimate objective is to overthrow the government and install something far worse. Now, I might add as well that Foreign Policy magazine, which is this a kind of imperial journal, they published a scathing appraisal of the results of color revolutions, which a few years back, which concluded that the results of each and every overthrow, for all of the talk of democracy rising at the time, and all of the praise that these revolutions garnered, and the media attention generated by the groups involved, they had absolutely appalling impacts on the target countries as well. So, like, the US knows that this stuff backfires, but they still keep doing it because they're out of ideas. Like they created an entire they've been created an entire generational class of people whose job it is to go around the world meddling with elections and destabilizing politics, and they know how to do no other. And because there's this groaning bureaucracy and so many people's salaries depend on it, it's not going anywhere, even though it's actively harmful to US interests. So, some rays of light amidst the darkness.
Well, yes, and I think this again it gives us a very good one of the segues today. A good way to pivot into our next and final story for this week, which is the recent Czech election, because again there is much to say here, and there is a Ukraine connection as well, which we'll come to in just a moment, with regards to the way in which democracy, again in heavy inverted commas there, so those of you listening on the audio only, is exercised inside the EU. Because the Czech election was won, as was anticipated, by the multi-millionaire Andrej Babis, who leads what's described as a populist anti-EU movement, and this was generating a lot of concern in the EU structures. They would have another case of like Orban and Fico on their hands. And I wanted just to mention that what they were actually concerned about was probably something else entirely, which is not necessarily Babis himself, who is a fairly standard Central European like right winger, to be honest, but who is a little bit less keen on the sort of European federalization than his opponents are. But what they were actually concerned about, and here I'll just scroll down, point 2 in the Politico article, which is that he won't have to make concessions to what Politico describes as the far left coalition entitled Stashila Enough, which I'm going to quote the Politico article now, calls for leaving both NATO and the EU and favors closer relations with Russia. It did not make the 5% threshold to enter parliament, despite strong polling during the campaign. Now, this was a coalition between the Communist Party of Bohemia and Moravia, rather fancy title, that was in alliance with the Czech Social Democrat, running specifically on an anti-NATO Eurosceptic platform. And this is falling quite well. So what did the Czech authorities do? They started a good old-fashioned anti-communist campaign that was pretty much specifically targeted at the Stachilo coalition in order to make sure that their initially strong polling went down. And it seems that some of the anti-EU votes went to Babis, and the coalition got around about 4.8% of the vote, so narrowly missing out by 0.2% from getting into parliament. I would argue that that was the principal concern of the EU and the Czech hierarchy, that you would end up with Babis, but with a strong presence from Stachilo in there, who would be able to force more anti-EU and anti-NATO measures into a Babis-led government. That, I think, was their real concern. Now, given that the Ukraine war is going to shit, Babis may be inclined to follow through on his talk of like not giving any more Czech money and resources to this, which will be enough to provoke a meltdown anyway inside the corridors of EU power. With any deviation from the norm is treated as an act of hostility, even from figures like Babis, who is no radical whatsoever. Looking at this, what is your read on the Czech situation?
Well, I mean, number one, I think the Politico, election explainer is very funny because it states openly Babiš is not Viktor Orban, who is built up as this Putinite wrecker in European affairs, to the extent that the EU is seriously considering blocking Hungary from voting in order to keep the proxy war grinding on. then the article goes on to repeatedly and in very insidiously try to imply that he is Victor Orban. Having said very clearly that he isn't. As you say, he is a pretty um, run of the mill right wing Central European politician. I think that what's actually interesting about the fact that he won so decisively, albeit not with a majority, is the fact that his comments on the campaign trail about ending support for Ukraine, they were very popular with Czechs themselves, who the Czech public, if you look at polls, they cannot be accused of harboring pro-Russian sympathies. They're very pro-Ukraine. The Czechia's political class, likewise, these are standard positions. It's a very rare thing indeed to hear positive sentiments about Russia or its leaders emanating from Czech politicians or the media, indeed. But it's like, I think that this shows that increasingly across Europe there is a widespread comprehension, even among countries that are extremely sympathetic to Ukraine, that all of this assistance we're providing is hurting us, like it to a very severe degree, and this is now becoming a mainstream view, and it's only because people like Macron and Merz are so war hungry, and their counterparts in the European Union are so belligerent and deranged, our old friend Kaya Kallas, that this is not seeping through. Like, if you look at polls, increasingly people do not think that Ukraine could win. They think that Ukraine should seek peace as soon as possible. And yeah, there is on issues. It's usually not framed in this way, but in issues which are a direct result of the war in Ukraine, such as the sanctions on Russia, or the material assistance being provided to Ukraine, that's having an absolutely ravaging impact on people's incomes, on the cost of living, on all sorts of other matters which influence voters. So it's now, yes, it's no longer. I think that Babiš victory is significant in the sense that, well, we've seen what they did in Romania, where it looked like an outsider with anti-NATO positions was going to win. Babiš is someone who has openly pledged his commitment to NATO and the EU, right? So, he was not someone who was going to be easily couged or indeed framed as, much like, say, Robert Fico, as a Kremlin puppet. So I again, in the spirit of maybe bloody-minded optimism, I do have a sense that this could catch on more widely in the region, because the region is really hurting. I mean, these are countries where already wages aren't particularly great, and job opportunities aren't profuse, and they are suffering even more greatly as a result of self-destructive sanctions, and just plowing endless money and all of their military equipment into an unwinnable quagmire, which could have ended on so many occasions.
Yeah, well, here we go to pivot to the unwinnable quagmire, because the final point for this week, and connected to the Czech elections, is that there appears to be some kind of maneuvering going on against our old friend, President Zelensky, former comedian and future probably presenter of a nightly chat show in the United States, if he gets out alive. His handlers in London seem to be growing tired of him. And there is, of course, talk now of them maneuvering former army general, now ambassador to Britain, again, cushiest job in the world, the former General Zaluzny, into a position of running for office. And this seems to be some kind of gambit engaged in by the British in order to do two things, I think. First of all, they clearly regard Zelensky as now being a busted flush. Whatever value he had has long since been expended. And two, by changing things up and bringing in Zaluzny, it's clearly a maneuver to revitalize the legitimacy in the Ukrainian, what's left of the Ukrainian political system. Because if you look at what's actually going on in Ukraine, even in Western Ukraine, there's mass rebellions against the press ganging of men into the service of the army. There is like as open revolt against Zelensky's rule. There is an increasing amount, and the former Swiss intelligence officer Jacques Beau covers this quite extensively, of underground movements now in Western Ukraine that aren't necessarily even pro-Russian, they're just anti-Kiev and they're anti the Maidan regime. This clearly has reached the point where London knows more about this than they're letting on, and they are becoming concerned that the longer they stick with Zelensky, there's a risk that the Kiev regime might implode. So what do? Well, if it gets to that point, you need to shuffle the deck. You need to bring in somebody new. So who do you have? Well, you have Zaluzny, who they can present as the war hero, the great leader who will come in, whip the state into shape, and lead the new crusade against the invading orc armies of the Russian Federation. This seems to be the maneuver, and it will not be a peace move. It will be a move to try and revitalize the Ukrainian state in order that they can continue to prosecute the war. That is what this maneuver will be, if indeed this is what the British are planning. Kit, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think the fact that, yes, the British are running this, and indeed that Zelensky is the ambassador to Britain, and he's now trying to build a political party to run for both president and parliament, it does tend to suggest that the British think that there will be an election soon. And there are grounds for that, which is, I mean, what's very clear is Zelensky publicly remains committed to, recapturing Crimea and, vanquishing the Russian hordes from Donbass. But I don't think, that's obviously completely ridiculous. But B, I don't think that the far right in Ukraine believe him, and I think that they suspect that he would, if it came to it, make a deal. Now you've got to bear in mind that like some of the harshest critics of Zelensky domestically are people like Andrei Beletsky, who was the founder of the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion, now regiment. And in an August interview with the Times of London, he was very critical of Zelensky, rejected any negotiation with Russia, and basically stated that his vision for Ukraine was perpetual war. And a permanently militarized society. There was another far right Ukrainian called Sergei Stonenko, who in a almost identical puff piece in the Times a few days later, openly threatened Zelensky's life and basically said, well, if Zelensky gives away any territory, he's going to be a corpse politically and then for real. And so, I mean, that's like, a fairly open threat against Zelensky. There are elements of the far right as well who see Maidan as an unfinished revolution. They want to install an outright, openly fascist government in Kiev rather than a government which is propped up by neo-Nazi and fascist elements. So Zelensky could be an answer to a lot of problems. It could revitalize public interest in the war. If Zelensky managed to get in, he is also someone who has gained a kind of mythic status in the media due to his supposedly exemplary stewardship of the Ukrainian armed forces. So he's kind of already a made man in that respect. The only problem is that if you do have a free and open election in Ukraine, which I mean seems very unlikely, there is always the risk that someone like Alexei Arestovich could win or at least do well. Now, Arestovich is Zelensky's former advisor and right-hand man who got kind of forced out in rather strange, kind of uncertain circumstances, and since then has become a kind of rather pugnacious critic of Zelensky for pursuing the war, and has suggested that Ukraine made the wrong decision by siding with the West, and that its future lies with positive relations with Russia. Due to geography, history, culture, etc. So, if such a vote is forthcoming, that could be a trap that the British are walking into. But I mean, it's Ukraine, so I sincerely doubt that it will be free and fair. And there's always the risk that Arestovich would just get killed if he tried to re-enter the country.
Well, I think there is the question of not only which candidate stands, but who counts the ballots. And I don't think that the British or the Americans would be getting themselves involved in the Ukrainian election unless they were pretty damn sure who was going to be counting the ballots. And I think that they would make sure that the standards for running would be so tight as to deny even someone like Arestovich a place on any kind of ticket. Because they would just basically say, "Oh, pro-Russian traitor, can't be done." I would also just say that Zaluzny's candidacy, and if he gets in, his administration would be specifically designed to make any further negotiation over Ukraine impossible because of his very close ties to the Ukrainian fascist movement, and also then his need then to serve them up further progress in what they regard as their revolution, which means more anti-Russian stuff. It means more openly fascistic policies, even more than that, which has been pursued by Zelensky and before him Poroshenko. So it would make any negotiation with the Russians impossible, given that one of the key parts of that negotiation that the Russians want to see is the denazification of Ukraine. If you've got a guy leading the country who's going around with like a Stepan Bandera badge on and with 2 busts of Bandera on his bookshelf, as we know Zaluzny have for a while, that's a no negotiation right there. That's a 0 percentage points of possibility that there's going to be one, which is again the reason why the British would bring him in, to make sure that Ukraine fought to the absolute last man, woman, child, pensioner, or dog. And I think that is, of course, the only future that the British have in mind for Ukraine. So I think a lot of Ukrainians realize that now. So I think that, unless you've got anything further to add to that point, Kit, I think that brings us to the end of the road for this particular week. A road which has been marked with the corpses of our enemies, metaphorically speaking. Jens Stoltenberg has been analyzed and found to be intellectually redundant. A moral, political, intellectual, and philosophical eunuch of the worst kind. A tittering conspirator in the halls of the great Byzantium known as the European Union and NATO, and they're typical of the political class in which he serves. If this episode leaves you disillusioned about the current leadership of Europe and indeed the Western world, then imagine this. Imagine that one day they will no longer be there, and that the system that they serve can be levered over and in fact toppled and destroyed, because what we are now facing is essentially a castle built on sinking sand. Those at the top are still looking out over what they imagine is a great expanse, but their towers are sinking into the mud, and it is up to us to push them further into the mud. So I will conclude my contributions on this subject with that rather poetic call to action. Kit, in the wanton people of socialist Yugoslavia.
Well, I mean, just Longfellow couldn't have put it better, Alex. Excellent closer, my friend. Yes, we must never forget that these people are pretty pathetic and ridiculous, and if we don't take them seriously, then there's always the chance that they might just vanish in a puff of logic or something. So yeah, don't give up hope. But no, I think it's been a great broadcast. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. God bless you. Take care.